Imagine a world where gathering to pray could cost you your life, where whispers of a carpenter's promise echo through hidden chambers, and stories of martyrs ignite hope in the darkest hour. In just 500 years, a secret sect of fishermen, scholars, and women would rise from crackling pyres in Asia Minor to gilded basilicas in imperial Rome and go on to shape history for millennia. Join us as we unravel the turbulent, triumphant first 5 centuries of the Catholic Church, from its fragile roots in Jerusalem's courtyards to the councils that defined orthodoxy and the monasteries that preserved a dying empire's soul. This is the story of faith forged in fire and a legacy that endures to this day. Welcome to Globe Threads, where we explore the defining moments that wove our world together. 30 AC, in the shadow of Jerusalem's temple complex, still the vibrant heart of Second Temple Judaism, a small cohort of disciples, led by Peter, James the Just, often called the first bishop of Jerusalem, and John, began gathering in private homes. These early ecclesiae assemblies, were defined not by monumental basilicas, but by their intimate fellowship, shared meals, Gemeinschaft prayer, and exegetical dialogue on the Hebrew Scriptures and the newly circulating Jesus tradition, Acts chapter 2 verse 46, Didache 11. As Tacitus later observed, these communities were distinguished by their ritual of mutual devotion, an ethos that bound believers across the empire by ties of hospitality and charity. By 4950 AC, tensions over Gentile inclusion prompted the Jerusalem Assembly, presided over by James the Just, to convene what Eusebius labels the Council of Jerusalem, Historia Ecclesiastica 2.22. Drawing on Paul's own account, Galatians chapter 2 verses 1 to 10, the council decreed that Gentile converts need not adopt circumcision or dietary laws, a judgment that preserved continuity with Judaism while unleashing Christianity's penetration into non-Jewish urban milieus. From Antioch's bustling port warehouses to Corinth's merchant quarters, Christian house churches leveraged Roman trade arteries and social networks to propagate rapidly, following patterns of social contagion later analyzed by scholars like Rodney Stark. Despite these networks, Christianity remained numerically modest. By circa 100 AC, perhaps fewer than 10,000 adherents, under 0.1% of the empire's 60 million inhabitants. Yet its relational latticework proved remarkably resilient. Ignatius of Antioch, writing around 110 AC, urged regional gatherings under a single bishop to forestall schisms, inaugurating the institutional contours that would define later ecclesial order. In July 64 AC, Rome's Great Fire provided Nero the pretext to scapegoat Christians, whom Tacitus accuses of hatred against mankind as they were arrested, tortured, and thrown to beasts. This first imperial persecution, though localized, set a tragic precedent. Christians were forced to perform pagan sacrifices under threat of execution or loss of citizenship rights. Subsequent emperors Decius in 250 AC, Valerian in 257 to 260 AC, issued edicts requiring public sacrifice. Refusal often meant confiscation of property or death. However, the phenomenon of martyrdom that so unnerved imperial authorities in Diocletian's reign had already been enshrined in the memory of the Church 2 centuries earlier by the arrest and execution of Polycarp, Bishop of Smyrna, in 155 AC. Polycarp was, by his own account, one of the very few living links to the apostolic age. He had known the Apostle John and had been appointed Bishop of Smyrna by the generation that followed the 12. As the center of a thriving Christian community on Asia Minor's Aegean coast, Smyrna both welcomed pilgrims and drew suspicion from local pagans. When a wave of persecution swept through the city under the proconsul Statius Quadratus, Polycarp was urged by fellow believers to slip away and preserve his life. He replied with calm resolve, reportedly saying, "God's will be done," and chose to remain among his flock rather than abandon them. Summoned before the proconsul in the amphitheater, Polycarp was pressed to swear by the genius of Caesar and to curse Christ. According to the surviving acta, he responded, 86 years I have served him, and he has done me no wrong. How then can I blaspheme my king who saved me?" When offered that single oath, he asked briefly for a moment's respite to reflect, and then refused outright. Dragged to a pyre, he was bound with a rope as flames rose. Witnesses record that the fire formed an arch around his body rather than consuming it, so that when the proconsul ordered a magistrate to stab him, his blood doused the flames and he fell asleep in the Lord. This dramatic close was preserved in the Martyrdom of Polycarp, one of the earliest such accounts to circulate widely in the Church, and it inspired believers throughout Asia Minor to stand firm in the face of edicts like those later issued by Diocletian. Polycarp's courage and peaceful demeanor became a touchstone for Christian identity. Martyrdom was not a defeat, but the ultimate affirmation that Christ's sovereignty transcended imperial power. By the early 310s, the grand experiment of Diocletian's tetrarchy lay in fragments. 4 rulers had been meant to share power and secure peaceful succession, But by 312, only two stalwarts remained, Constantine in the west and Maxentius in Rome. When Constantius, Constantine's father, died in Britain in 306, his troops hailed Constantine as emperor. Yet back in the capital, Maxentius claimed the mantle, erecting walls and drumming up support among senators and the Praetorian Guard. Determined to press his claim, Constantine crossed the Alps with a loyal army of perhaps 30,000 veterans and marched into Italy. His advance was steady but cautious. He knew that Maxentius controlled the vital Via Flaminia and could choke off his supply lines. By late October, the two forces met at the narrow Milvian Bridge, spanning the swollen Tiber just north of the city walls. The night before battle, Constantine confided to his officers that he had been struck by a vision. He described a blazing cross in the sky, two arms of light forming the Greek letters Chi and Rho, the monogram of Christ accompanied by a promise. In this sign, conquer. Whether in a waking trance or vivid dream, he was convinced this omen came from a power beyond the old gods. By dawn he had his standard refashioned into the labarum, a banner bearing the cross, and ordered his men to carry it into battle. As the river's current threatened their ships, Constantine's legions charged the bridge in tight formations. Maxentius's troops, unprepared for such ferocity and unnerved by the strange new symbol, wavered. In the chaos, many plunged into the rapids. The battered emperor himself drowned while attempting to flee. By nightfall, Constantine stood victorious, his gamble vindicated, his authority undeniable. Within months, he and his eastern rival Licinius proclaimed the Edict of Milan. More than an armistice, it was a revolution in religious policy. All subjects, Christians and pagans alike, were guaranteed freedom of worship. Confiscated churches, cemeteries, and sacred scrolls were to be returned with interest, and those long convicted under imperial decree were to walk free, their names cleared. No longer would Christian gatherings be hunted into dank catacombs. Bishops could meet openly, and martyrs' stories passed from mouth to mouth without fear of reprisal. The immediate effects were electric. Basilicas rose from the ruins of private homes. Imperial gold-funded clergy stipends and pilgrimage roads. Christian charity infirmaries, orphanages, food distributions spread through markets and ports once hostile to the faith. And as Constantine himself leaned ever more on Christian advisors, the church gained a voice in matters of statecraft. Over the coming decade, the boundaries between throne and altar blurred. Convenings at Nicaea, the dawn of a unified creed, and the founding of Constantinople all bore the imprint of that fateful sign in the sky. What began as one man's vision at Milvian Bridge would reshape the Roman world and, in time, all of Europe, by forging an alliance between empire and church that would endure for centuries. Suddenly, Christianity was no longer a clandestine movement, but a fully visible and legally protected religion woven into the fabric of imperial life. In cities across the empire, grand basilicas sprang up on prominent sites. In Rome, the Lateran Basilica and Old St. Peter's, commissioned by Constantine in the 320s, occupied vast courtyards at the heart of civic quarters. In Milan, the Church of the Apostles transformed the former imperial palace into a center of worship. These buildings were not mere gathering halls but multifunctional complexes. Their atria hosted charitable distributions of grain and oil. Their porticos sheltered the poor, and their chancels served as venues for catechetical instruction and public readings of scripture. With imperial sponsorship came new administrative responsibilities for the clergy. Bishops, once obscure leaders of house churches, now presided over diocesan networks that paralleled the civil prefectures. They collected tithes and legacies, managed endowments for widows and orphans, and adjudicated disputes over inheritance in ecclesiastical courts, whose canons drawn from synodal decrees issued at councils such as Arles, 314, and later Nicaea, 325, began to acquire the force of law. These courts handled issues ranging from marital annulments to accusations of clergy misconduct, often cooperating with the secular praetor's office by sending certified verdicts into the imperial registries. As Christianity's institutional footprint grew, so did the stature of its leading prelates. In Rome, the bishop inherited the ancient title of Pontifex Maximus, once borne by Julius Caesar and Augustus, and repurposed it to signify supreme guardian of the Christian faith. By dispensing absolutions, granting dispensations, and issuing letters dimissary for clergy transfers, the Roman bishop accrued moral authority that transcended diocesan boundaries. Envoys from distant seas sought his arbitration, and imperial edicts frequently acknowledged his decisions as binding. Over the course of Constantine's reign and that of his sons, this aggregation of judicial, liturgical, and diplomatic power laid the groundwork for what would become recognized as papal primacy. In provincial cities, the surge of ecclesiastical activity also reshaped local governance. Councils of clergy, often summoned by the provincial vicarius alongside the governor, issued binding rulings on liturgical uniformity, clerical discipline, and charitable policy. Monastic communities too benefited from imperial patronage. Endowed by wealthy converts, they formed centers of learning and manuscript production, preserving not only Christian texts but also classical knowledge. By the mid-4th century, the Church's parallel bureaucracy of deacons, archdeacons, and metropolitan bishops provided an alternative framework of order and welfare that in many regions equaled or even supplanted the reach of traditional Roman administration. In barely a generation, Christianity had evolved from an illegal sect into a structured, empire-wide institution whose legal protections and social services became indispensable to the late antique world. When the emperor's protection lifted Christianity out of the shadows, it also thrust long-standing debates onto the imperial stage. Questions once argued in whispering house churches now required public resolution. What did it mean to call Jesus Son of God, if God is one? In Alexandria, a gifted presbyter named Arius taught that the Son was not co-eternal with the Father but a firstborn creature. There was when he was not. His sermons, supported by powerful factions in the city, emphasized Scripture's testimony that the Father is greater than I. Opposing him was Bishop Alexander of Alexandria, who argued that if the Son were not fully divine, salvation itself would be hollow. Alexander's young deacon, Athanasius, sharpened this argument. Only if the Son shares the Father's eternity and substance, Mousios, can Christ's life-giving power reconcile fallen humanity to God. By 321 AC, rioting clerics in Alexandria prompted Constantine to summon a synod. But disorder there only underscored the need for a universal council. In June of 325, at Nicaea in Bithynia, Constantine assembled some 318 bishops from across the empire, Latin West and Greek East, major sees and small frontier dioceses alike. Over several weeks, they debated not only the language of the creed, but also procedural questions. How many bishops must agree to override the voice of a local synod? Which theological terms were Catholic, and which novel? Finally, under imperial pressure for unity, the bishops adopted a creed stating that the Son is begotten, not made, consubstantial, mousion, with the Father. They anathematized Arius and his followers in a series of canons that also laid down rules for episcopal conduct, the date of Easter, and jurisdictional boundaries. Yet Arianism did not vanish with the council's signatures. Many Eastern bishops privately retained Arian sympathies, and some of Constantine's successors, like Constantius II, favored the semi-Arian compromise that spoke of the Son as, like Nemeusios, the Father, without full substance. Meanwhile, beyond the empire's borders, Gothic tribes adopted Arian forms of Christianity, setting up rival church hierarchies in the Danube frontier. By 381 AC, the need for decisive clarity brought Emperor Theodosius I to convene the First Council of Constantinople. Over 150 bishops, including stalwarts like Gregory of Nazianzus and Basil of Caesarea, reaffirmed Nicaea's substance language and added precise language about the Holy Spirit, who with the Father and the Son is worshipped and glorified, who spoke through the prophets. In doing so, they produced the expanded Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, cementing the doctrine that Father, Son, and Spirit share one undivided divinity. This theological settlement, with its carefully chosen Greek terms, would become the touchstone of orthodoxy throughout the Byzantine world and, centuries later, of both Western and Eastern churches alike. As the Western Empire's civil machinery unraveled under repeated incursions, the Church's organization provided an indispensable framework of continuity and care. By the early 5th century, every Roman province was mirrored by an episcopal province, each led by a metropolitan bishop whose authority extended over the diocesan network of local bishops. These prelates maintained registers of wills and legacies, oversaw grain distributions to the poor from church granaries, and mediated disputes that secular courts could no longer reliably adjudicate. In urban centers, the diaconiae charitable agencies attached to cathedral precincts distributed alms, organized relief during famines, and even managed hospitals, ensuring that civic welfare outlasted crumbling civic institutions. When Alaric's Visigoths breached Rome's walls in August 410, it was not a praetor or prefect but Pope Innocent I, and soon after him, Pope Boniface I, who organized relief for displaced citizens, negotiating safe passage for refugees and coordinating food convoys from Ostia's granaries. 4 decades later, in 452, Pope Leo I personally intercepted Attila's advance in the fields near Mantua. Drawing upon both his imperial connections and his moral authority, Leo secured a promise from the Hun leader to spare the Eternal City. Though the precise terms went unrecorded, contemporaries credited the Pope's prayers and exhortations with persuading Attila to redirect his forces, underscoring how the Bishop of Rome had become not only a spiritual shepherd, but a diplomat whose word could still check barbarian swords. Parallel to the episcopal network, the monastic movement blossomed as a countercultural force shaping late antiquity. In Egypt, Antony the Great withdrew to the desert ca. 270, living as a solitary anchorite, whose radical asceticism attracted disciples and led to the first informal sketes clusters of hermits linked by spiritual counsel. In Cappadocia, Basil the Great codified the communal, cenobitic, ideal around 356, founding the monastery at Annecy and authoring the Regula Basiliana, which balanced liturgical prayer, manual labor, and scriptural reading under abbatial oversight. In the West, Benedict of Nursia arrived at Monte Cassino around 529 and drafted his Regula to impose moderation. Monks rose at midnight for vigiliae, worked the fields at dawn, and studied in the scriptorium by day, all under the motto, ora et labora, prayer and work. These monasteries became bulwarks of learning and social service. Their scriptoria copied not only biblical manuscripts but also classical texts, Virgil, Cicero, Galen, preserving the literary heritage through the Dark Ages. Monastic estates introduced advanced agricultural methods, terracing, watermill technology, and vineyard cultivation, which stabilized food supplies and generated surplus for charity. Guest houses, xenodochia, on monastery lands sheltered pilgrims and travelers, while infirmaries cared for the sick. By the late 6th century, figures such as Cassiodorus and Isidore of Seville would draw upon monastic networks to compile encyclopedias and histories, laying the intellectual foundations for medieval Europe. In this way, as imperial legions faded from the Rhine and Danube frontiers, it was the twin pillars of episcopal governance and monastic community that upheld Western civilization's legal order, educational tradition, and spirit of charity. Between 476 and 500 AD, as the last vestiges of Roman civil authority in the West gave way to new barbarian kingdoms, the Christian Church emerged not only as a spiritual compass, but as the de facto guardian of social order and learning. In Italy, the Gothic king Theodoric the Great himself, an Arian Christian, maintained the formal structures of Roman administration, yet he entrusted much of the day-to-day governance to the Catholic episcopate. Bishops such as Ennodius of Pavia, later Bishop of Milan, oversaw grain distributions to urban poor, adjudicated inheritance disputes in place of defunct prefects, and organized relief when famine struck in 488 to 489. Meanwhile, in Rome itself, Popes Simplicius, 468 to 483, and Gelasius I, 492 to 496, asserted their authority over civic as well as doctrinal matters. Simplicius negotiated with Odoacer's successor, Theodoric, to protect church property from Gothic exactions, and Gelasius famously articulated the two swords theory, distinguishing the spiritual sovereignty of the Pope from the temporal rule of kings, an argument that would shape medieval political thought. In North Africa, too, the Church buttressed communal life amid upheaval. Although the Vandal conquest, 429 to 439, brought a new Arian regime to Carthage, the Catholic bishops maintained the ancient networks of charity and education. Bishop Fulgentius of Ruspe, circa 468 to 533, exiled several times for his confessions of faith, continued to write treatises defending Augustine's theology of grace, ensuring that Latin theological scholarship survived even under oppressive rule. Back in the former provinces of Gaul, councils such as that of Orange in 441 codified discipline for clergy and laity alike, preserving Roman legal forms in their canons, even as the Visigoths consolidated their kingdom in Toulouse. Monasticism, having already taken root in Egypt and Cappadocia, found new expression in the West during this half-century. In those desert communities, the cenobitic model, literally common life, had taken shape. Monks lived together under a single rule and an abbot's authority, rising for communal prayer at midnight, sharing tasks in the fields or workshops by day, and gathering in the scriptorium to copy texts and study scripture. Figures like Saint Benedict's contemporary Martin of Braga, circa 520 to 580, brought this disciplined rhythm to Galicia, founding monasteries that not only sustained the divine office, but also taught reading, script copying, and basic medicine to both monks and local villagers. Meanwhile, in Britain and Ireland, the earlier peregrinations of monks such as Patrick, circa 389 to 461, had planted monastic cells that by the late 5th century functioned not only as centers of evangelization, but as the only local schools where Latin grammar was learned, biblical passages parsed, and even rudimentary arithmetic practiced under the watchful guidance of the brethren. By the close of the 5th century, the Church's web of bishops, monasteries, and local synods had preserved the administrative techniques, legal culture, and intellectual heritage of Rome. Cathedrals, whether old Roman basilicas retrofitted in Ravenna or humble timber churches in rural Francia, functioned as places of worship, courts of justice, and depositories of archives. Through their networks of charity, education, and moral authority, these ecclesiastical institutions held together communities that otherwise would have fractured in the wake of imperial collapse. As the 6th century dawned, the Church stood poised to carry forward the legacy of Rome into a transformed Europe, its structures secure, its mission clear, and its leadership unchallenged by any earthly power. In these first 5 centuries, the Church's journey from a handful of disciples in Jerusalem to a sprawling, continent-spanning institution was anything but linear. In the earliest days, believers met in private homes and secret catacombs, bound together by shared stories of Christ's passion and resurrection. Their cohesion depended on personal relationships, apostles, prophets, and elders who taught by word of mouth, rehearsing Christ's teachings in looms of hospitality and prayer. Yet, as persecution intensified under emperors like Nero and Diocletian, these same bonds of fellowship were transmuted into acts of witness. Martyrs whose unshaken faith illuminated the darkest arenas. Polycarp in Smyrna, Perpetua in Carthage, taught that suffering itself could be a form of preaching, drawing new converts into the fold even as imperial might sought to stamp Christianity out. Legal recognition in 313 did more than free Christians from clandestine worship. It set the stage for profound institutional evolution. Worship moved into basilicas, public spaces, redolent with incense and chant, where liturgies developed elaborate rites of baptism, Eucharist, and the veneration of saints. Governance took shape along Roman administrative lines, as bishops emerged as civic overseers, paralleled by councils convened under imperial aegis to resolve doctrinal crises. The fragile unity wrestled with Arius at Nicaea and simmered anew over the Spirit at Constantinople. Yet each synod refined the language of orthodoxy, forging a theological foundation that would endure for centuries. Meanwhile, monastic life preserved both spiritual rigor and classical learning. In deserts and river valleys, communities under Basil's and Benedict's rules became crucibles of liturgy, scriptoria, and social care, anchoring education, hospitality, and almsgiving in regions ravaged by political collapse. By 500 AD, Christ's followers no longer hid from the state but guided it. Bishops negotiated with barbarian kings, monasteries cultivated fields and mines alike, and cathedral chapters administered justice and charity. This resilient synthesis of friendship, doctrine, and organized ministry, rooted in courage and refined by debate, became the template of Christendom. It laid the cornerstone for medieval society, ensuring that the Church would continue to shape the cultural and spiritual contours of Europe long after the last Roman emperor faded into history.